Mercedes has been openly flirting with stealing Red Bull's star driver all year, and now Red Bull started to return the favour. Christian Horner's given a very strong hint that George Russell could become a serious target for Red Bull to sign for 2026. Red Bull may need to plug some gaps in its lineups after years of pretty chronic failure with its young driver programme, so is willing to look outside its own driver pool. And Horner says it would be foolish not to consider Russell, who is out of contract at Mercedes at the end of next year. Russell's been a Mercedes protege for a long time, paid his dues at Williams and stepped up to the works team just as its dominance ended and its struggles in the ground effect era began. He's become a race winner with Mercedes though, and was earmarked to be the team's leader once Lewis Hamilton finally retired. When Hamilton's shock Ferrari move for 2025 was revealed earlier this year, Russell's position seemed to become even more assured. And as Mercedes' form has improved, it's looked like Russell's patience might finally pay off, with his team on a trajectory that could take it back to being a championship challenger again. But even if Mercedes gets there, with the new rules in 2026 a great chance to reset the pecking order, Russell might not actually be around to benefit. Mercedes has decided to promote its teenage prodigy Kimi Antonelli to an F1C after just 1 year in F2 as Hamilton's replacement. And since Mercedes has been chasing Max Verstappen very hard, it's left quite a few people in the F1 paddock and a lot of fans wondering if Antonelli and Verstappen is Mercedes' future lineup. There is at least a chance that Russell finds himself frozen out at Mercedes long term, and that could be to Red Bull's gain. Right now, Mercedes is adamant it is very happy with Russell, reiterates how highly it rates him, and says it wants to focus on maximising 2025 with him and Antonelli. Team boss Toto Wolff bluntly dismissed Horner's remarks as him always trying to stir the shit. He said Russell is a Mercedes driver, has been forever, and hopefully will be forever, because we have a long contract with him. Maybe there is a way to hold on to Russell for many more years if that is what Mercedes wants, but publicly, Russell is actually on a short contract with the F1 team. He signed a new deal in 2023 that Mercedes said runs until the end of 2025. While Wolff is annoyed with Horner for talking about Russell in such terms, ultimately it's Wolff who is responsible for the Mercedes driver narrative going this way. Wolff's the one who was keen to promote Antonelli and has talked him up as much as he has, while chasing Verstappen at the same time. And even though Mercedes has accepted it can't get Verstappen for next year, it hasn't ended the pursuit entirely. Wolff wants to try again later, and the next opportunity will be for 2026. 3 drivers into 2 seats will not go, so how does Mercedes resolve that? When Antonelli was announced as a 2025 driver, Mercedes never revealed the duration of his contract, and as we said, Russell's deal runs to the end of 2025. So Mercedes has given itself the flexibility to sign Verstappen if it wants, but it will have to drop one of its own to get him, and given Antonelli's been touted as a star of the future, that makes it more likely that Russell will have to go. Unsurprisingly, Wolff doesn't want to entertain what-ifs, at least not about his own drivers, and doesn't think this is a relevant topic until the 2025 season is well underway and the picture becomes clearer. Maybe Verstappen's not going to be an option at all. Maybe Mercedes drivers are both stunningly good, and so the decision to keep both and not bother with Max is actually the easy one. What we can say is that Russell's potential availability is based on more than just being out of contract. The circumstances at Mercedes could change so that he no longer fits into the team's plans. And however this plays out at Mercedes, we will probably find out quite quickly if Red Bull is genuinely keen on pouncing or is just playing some games of its own after spending the last few months dealing with Mercedes courting Verstappen. Horner first talked about Russell earlier this year when trying to deflect from one of Wolff's initial remarks about luring Verstappen away. It was back at the Chinese Grand Prix in April, and Horner was growing weary of what he called noise being generated by what he insisted was a baseless attempt to get Verstappen to leave. Horner asked the journalists in his media session, "Have you heard George Russell is out of contract at the end of 2025? Maybe he might not be so keen into 2026. The market moves around." The funny thing was that Russell's contractual status was actually well established, as his Mercedes announcement the previous summer had already specified that date, so it felt like Horner just scrambling to move the conversation elsewhere. But now he's raised it again in a much more specific Red Bull's driver deliberations context. We can't help but wonder if it was way back then that Russell was already on Red Bull's radar. Red Bull is in a driver crisis of its own making. Verstappen staying for 2025 and under contract until the end of 2028, but nobody believes his future at this team is secure because of various Red Bull issues including power struggles, Jos Verstappen's feud with Horner, and the team's poor competitive trajectory. Even worse for Red Bull than potentially losing its superstar driver is that it has failed completely to create a contingency plan, at least so far, and has bungled the management of its own talent program. Repeatedly turning to signings from elsewhere has ultimately not worked. Verstappen's teammate Sergio Perez was a decent stopgap, but he's been clinging onto his drive for a while now. Daniel Ricciardo was brought back into the fold in his 30s as a fullback, and Red Bull put him back in its junior team by replacing Nick de Vries, who was a baffling Red Bull recruit in the first place. But Ricciardo's been unspectacular and his career looks over for good. And let's not go too far back into the string of Red Bull driver failures, like the impatience shown to Perez's predecessors Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon, continually overlooking Carlos Sainz, and the promote him, demote him, sack him, re-sign him, sack him again Daniel Kvyat saga. Meanwhile, the best performing Red Bull Junior for a few years, Yuki Tsunoda, is not even taken seriously as a senior team option because of supposed doubts about his mentality and approach. So whether Verstappen leaves or Red Bull just needs a better teammate for him, there is no obvious driver to step in. That's why Liam Lawson's now in the frame to replace Ricciardo for the last few races of 2024, which we think is so Red Bull can evaluate him as a potential Perez alternative at Red Bull Racing next year. He is at least a Red Bull Junior, but that could mean he ends up in the senior team having never raced a full season in F1. That's as good as Red Bull's driver options get, and it's still pretty chaotic. Horner's acknowledgement that Red Bull is willing to look at drivers from outside its own program yet again is where Russell comes in. Horner brought him up completely unprompted. It wasn't a leading question that tricked him into putting Russell's name out there. Really, any consideration of Russell has to be as a replacement for Verstappen. Red Bull's never wanted to pair Verstappen with someone who could give him a hard time, and Russell as a driver on track and a personality off it would not settle for being a number 2. The drivers have also had some run-ins on track together, so while they're hardly mortal enemies, this just doesn't feel like a sensible fit. It's only logical to conclude that Red Bull sees Russell as a potential Verstappen Plan B to consider depending on how the driver market evolves and if Red Bull loses Verstappen. Maybe this is Horner's first real admission that Red Bull does need to plan for life after Max. Mercedes isn't going to give up trying to convince him, and there have already been questions about whether Aston Martin could make a play. Its Megabucks project has already taken some big pieces from Red Bull, including the Works Honda engine that Verstappen's been so fond of for the last few years, and technical guru Adrian Newey. But we should also remember that Verstappen isn't just a target for other teams, he's got half an eye on walking away from F1 on his own. Verstappen's made it clear several times he might not stay in F1 beyond his current Red Bull deal, but he's also hinted he could leave sooner. He's growing weary of F1's ever-expanding calendar, the proliferation of street tracks, the pursuit of more sprint races, and the increasing commercial and marketing demand F1 is putting on its drivers. And a recent feud with the FIA after getting a community service order for swearing in a press conference has revived Verstappen's feeling that this might not be worth it. He says these kinds of things definitely decide his future, as he finds dealing with such silly things really tiring. His attitude is that he's already achieved more than he targeted, and he's keen to race other things, so if F1's just not worth the hassle, he'll stop. Whether Verstappen's tempted away by another team or just grows too disenchanted with F1 altogether, Red Bull needs a plug-in-and-play lead driver, which it doesn't have waiting in the wings. There are decent longer-term options in F2 title contender Isaac Hadjar and F3 race winner Arvid Lindblad, but they are not in the frame for 2025 seats, and 2026 is going to come way too soon to consider them for Red Bull Racing. So even though Wolff was saying this is just Horner talking nonsense, what lends the most weight to the idea that Red Bull would genuinely want to swoop for Russell is the fact it makes a lot of sense. Russell's got his doubters, but he is very good. His qualifying speed is consistently excellent, he's demolished Lewis Hamilton on Saturdays this year, and while he has made the odd high-profile error and has sometimes been overzealous with his race management, he's also produced some very assured drives and is a proven race winner. Russell is a World Championship challenger in the right car, and if Verstappen walked away tomorrow, none of Red Bull's current options could claim to be at that level. So Russell as a free agent in 2026 could solve a big Red Bull problem if Verstappen did walk away or was courted by a rival team. It would give Red Bull a lead driver it can count on, and buy some time if Lawson is showing promise but is rough around the edges, or it needs a Hadjar or a Lindblad or someone else to come good. Who knows where the driver market will actually go in the next 18 months, how many drivers Red Bull will need to find, and which options will actually emerge. There might be other candidates for Red Bull to consider, like its former drivers Sainz and Albon. Both are signed up at Williams for the long term, but would jump at the chance to get into race-winning machinery in 2026 and beyond if Red Bull's in-house engine program is good enough and the Williams revival is still a work in progress. Based on how ridiculous the driver market's been this year, we can't rule anything out. But there is already a young, race-winning driver seemingly out of contract for 2026, so Red Bull would be negligent not to be seriously considering Russell already.